Hola, 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 hola.
Muy buenos días para todas y todos. Bienvenidos a la Universidad Nacional de Colombia, sede Manizales. Nos encontramos hoy, en este día tan especial, en el campus Palo Grande, uno de nuestros 3 campus. Y nos encontramos aquí en el auditorio Juan Hurtado, un auditorio muy importante en la historia de nuestra sede. Estamos celebrando este año 75 años. 75 años haciendo historia, como lo podemos ver acá. Desde el 3 de marzo comenzamos toda la comunidad universitaria, profesores, estudiantes, administrativos, egresados, familiares cercanos a la Universidad Nacional, a celebrar con el alma estos 75 años. Y esa celebración tiene como parte de sus actividades una serie de conferencias que se han extendido y seguirán extendiéndose hasta final de año. Hemos contado con la suerte, hemos contado con la buena voluntad de grandes conferencistas que nos han estado acompañando durante estos meses del 2023. El día de hoy tenemos un invitado extremadamente especial. Tengo el gusto de presentarles al profesor Christian Burgemeister. El profesor Christian Burgemeister vive en Bonn, Alemania. Es profesor de la Universidad de Bonn y director del CEF, Centro de Desarrollo. El profesor Burgemeister seguramente al comienzo de su conferencia nos va a explicar un poco sobre él y sobre su trayectoria. Tuve la oportunidad de conocer al profesor Burgemeister hace unos meses en Bonn, en una visita institucional que nos permitió establecer una relación más cercana entre la Universidad Nacional, particularmente la sede Manizales, y la Universidad de Bonn, particularmente su centro de investigación y desarrollo. Cuando nos conocimos personalmente, me alegré mucho cuando logramos visualizar él y yo este día. Este día, la vicerrectoría de la sede lo ha estado esperando desde ese entonces y hoy es una realidad, con un regalo adicional para nosotros. Y es que lo acompaña también el día de hoy al profesor Burgemeister, su esposa, la doctora Juliana Jaramillo. La doctora Juliana Jaramillo es agrónoma y tiene todos los estudios que se hacen en una determinada área, experta nacional e internacional en el café, acreedora de 2 premios nacionales Alejandro Escobar. Para los que no lo saben, ese es como nuestro Nobel colombiano. La doctora Juliana manizaleña. Próximamente también nos va a dar una conferencia. Hemos comenzado negociaciones. Professor Burgemeister, welcome to Manizales. This is your house. It's my pleasure to introduce you to part of our community. We are very grateful with you for your presence, for your conference. Please take this auditorium as your family as well. Thank you very much for being part of the celebration of the 75 years of presence of our campus in the region of Manizales. Esta conferencia será grabada. Esta conferencia se va a compilar en un libro digital que nosotros vamos a entregarle a toda la comunidad a final de año, en donde estarán todas las conferencias que hemos recibido. Sin más, les pido que recibamos con un fuerte aplauso de gratitud al profesor Christian Burgemeister.
Muchas gracias, profesor Guerrero, por la invitación. Yo soy muy contento en la Universidad Nacional aquí en Manizales. Desafortunadamente mi español es un poco limitado, certamente es limitado por una conferencia científica. Entonces, la conferencia es en inglés, pero mi esposa, Juliana, puedo traducir un resumen de la conferencia en español a la fin de mi presentación, y también tenemos ayuda profesional por la traducción en la sección de potencialmente de respuestas. Entonces, en inglés. Yo continúo en inglés, desafortunadamente. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be here. I consider Manizales really like a second home. I've been coming to Manizales since 20 years now. I've seen the university very often from the house of my in-laws. We can see from the living room this campus. So I also consider this as a second university home. And as Neil, if I may say so, as Neil pointed out, there is already quite a lot of close collaboration between the University of Bonn and Universidad Nacional. We have a joint graduate program. The social scientists at ZEF have a joint graduate program with your colleagues in Bogota. And my group, as Neil mentioned, I'm a natural scientist. So we are trying to establish closer ties with Nacional in Manizales, hopefully, which, fingers crossed, will lead to a whole lot of joint activities. With any further ado, let me switch to my little presentation. I wanted to talk a little bit about planetary crisis and how holistic thinking can hopefully contribute a little bit to address these planetary crises. Now, I think everybody of you will agree that global change has undisputably become a reality. I've chosen these photos, especially the middle one, a little bit to illustrate what we are looking at. The middle one is actually a photo of the River Rhine in Bonn during the summer of 2019. We all talk about this summer of 2023 as beating heat records. For our particular region, 2019 was pretty devastating in terms of a heat wave. And this illustrates a little bit the river. The River Rhine is like a super highway in Central Europe. It's one of the most important waterways. And you can imagine Switzerland being a landlocked country at the source of the river. This is the lifeline for Switzerland. So the summer of 2019 was so hot and so dry that the water level in the Rhine, which in the middle is usually around 3 meters, dropped to about 65 centimeters. So courageous people were actually wading across the river. So the river was so low that any kind of commercial shipping had ceased. So in terms of the changes that we are seeing, the most important drivers of global change are obviously climate change and global environmental change. And to address these complex problems, the scientific community has more or less agreed that any kind of compartmentalized approaches to these complex problems are futile. So only with system thinking that encompasses various areas, various disciplines at the same time, we are able to address these problems all encompassing and in a more holistic fashion. Now, one relatively recent example, and which I want to focus this presentation on, is the so-called One Health approach, or the One Health paradigm. And this One Health paradigm tries to bring together the health concerns, the health problems, and the health domains of humans, of animals, and of the environment. Now, this One Health paradigm has yielded myriads of definitions, sometimes competing definitions. I would like to stick with the most recent one, which was developed 2022 by the One Health high-level expert panel. So it stipulates that One Health is an integrated, unifying approach that tries to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and the environment. Now, it recognizes that humans, domestic and wild elements, and plants, plus the wider environment, which includes ecosystems, they are closely linked and interlinked. And through this kind of holistic approach, we will be able to mobilize sectors, disciplines, and communities at varying levels of society to kind of address and foster the well-being and tackle threats to health and the environment, while always being conscientious of these kind of overarching global threats like adapting to climate change. To encapsulate this a little bit more visually, you see you have these 3 different domains. You've got the environment, you've got human and animals. This is the kind of disciplines that are coming together, and you have different groups in society, be it rural, urban, mobile communities. You've got regional and national as well as local interactions, and you have this approach of striving for inclusivity, equity, and access. And these kind of two areas, through the means of communication, collaboration, coordination, and capacity building, leads to this kind of complex paradigm of One Health, which tries to address the health of animals, wild as well as domesticated, the ecosystem, as well as the health of humans. So far, hopefully a not too boring, abstract introduction of this paradigm. What I would like to do is to embark on practical examples. I'm not very much strong in theory, has never been my favorite area. So I like to be more focusing my research on practical things. So what I would like to tell you is two stories, two examples, how this One Health paradigm can be put into actions. And I'm going to focus on the health side. And I'm going to give you two examples, two case studies that are focusing on vector-borne diseases. Why vector-borne diseases? Selfishly, I'm an entomologist. So my area of expertise are insects, and I've been working for the last 10, 15 years, quite a lot on infectious diseases, vector-borne infectious diseases. So in specific, I would like to tell you something about malaria, with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa, where malaria still persists to be a very grave problem. And I will tell you a little bit about arboviral diseases like dengue, like chikungunya, like Zika, which are very much household names now across the world and including in Latin America. But let me start with malaria, which is still the number one in terms of infectious diseases. And this is, if you can see, is one of the most dangerous organisms that we have on this planet. This is a little mosquito called Anopheles gambiae, the main vector species, the main mosquito species that transmits malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the single most important cause of mortality and morbidity in developing countries. WHO in 2022 estimated approximately 250 million clinical cases and more than 600,000 deaths, according to malaria. Now, this is a little bit up compared to 2019, and we are back in COVID. This is, COVID is more or less the explanation for this uptick in numbers. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the decline in numbers in a second, but prior to 2019, over a period of 10, 15 years, the yearly death rate of malaria started to decline, whereas as a consequence of COVID, it took up. And why was this so? Simple: lockdown. Lockdown affected the distribution of drugs, preventive drugs, curative drugs, and prevented interventions against malaria, which then caused an uptick. We've seen exactly the same phenomenon. You might recall about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a massive Ebola outbreak in West Africa, particularly in countries like Guinea-Conakry and Liberia and Sierra Leone, which caused approximately 15,000 people to die of Ebola. The death toll to malaria in these countries is roughly estimated at 60 to 70,000 during this period of time. So the death toll to malaria during this period was much higher than due to Ebola, because the public health system under Ebola completely collapsed in these countries, and drug delivery and vector control came to a standstill, leading to an upsurge in malaria. Few people talked about this at that time. Now, Africa In Africa, malaria is the #1 killer, and it particularly affects children under 5 and pregnant women. These are the two most vulnerable groups in the human population affected by malaria. So the death toll of pregnant women and children under 5 constitute about 80% of the global deaths to malaria. Once you make it as a child in an area where malaria is very prevalent through the first 5 years of your life, you acquire a certain level of immunity to malaria, and then subsequent infections tend to be less mortal. 80% of the world mortality to malaria occurs in Africa, south of the Sahara, and about 90% of morbidity also in Africa, south of the Sahara. And economists estimate that if you want the global bill or the continental bill to malaria in Africa is approximately $12 billion per year. Economists consider malaria as the greatest obstacle for economic development in sub-Saharan Africa. So far to the gloomy part. Let's look a little bit at the more positive aspects. Since 2000, approximately 3.3 million lives have been saved due to malaria control, which is an enormous number. Malaria mortality globally reduced by 45% in Africa, nearly half. And today in Africa, 54% fewer children die of malaria than before 2000. So over the last period of approximately 20 years, we've made enormous progress in kind of reducing the burden of malaria. Infections went down by approximately a third, globally as well as in Africa. Now you ask yourself, how was this done? And the answers are twofold. The first is through new drugs, new curative drugs, which are based on a combination therapy of 2 active ingredients. One, which is called artemisinin. It's artemisinin based, and the second are conventional, already existing curative drugs, which are combined with this new active ingredient, artemisinin. Why? Because you might remember this from antiretroviral drugs that are used for AIDS treatment. They are a combination of 3 different, in this case, 3 different active ingredients. Because if you combine 1, 2, or 3 or more active ingredients that operate differently in the biochemical and molecular processes of your host organism, the chances for the pathogen to develop resistance against these drugs are dramatically reduced. So the combination therapy, which is very often administered in Africa as a drug called Coartem, manufactured by Novartis as a non-profit exercise, and recommended by WHO as the first line of defense against malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. This kind of combination therapy has become incredibly important in reducing malaria. Now, let me digress for 1 second. Artemisinin is a secondary plant metabolite of a plant called Artemisia annua, sometimes also called the Chinese wormwood. This is a shrub that is growing in China, and this has been used for hundreds of years by Chinese peasants as a means to treat fever. A bit like, you remember aspirin. Aspirin is based on, or is the fundament of aspirin are leaves of the salix tree. It's a riverine tree in Europe, and herbal women in Europe have been using concoctions of these leaves to treat fever over hundreds of years. The same is true for Artemisia annua. This has been used as traditional medicine in China for more than 500 years. And a big shout out to Tu Youyou, an ethnopharmacologist from China, who in the 1970s and 80s started to work scientifically on this plant and identified as the key active ingredient in this shrub, Artemisia annua, this compound artemisinin. And this is presently the most powerful drug we have, the most powerful active ingredient that is known to men to fight tropical malaria in an incredibly efficient and in an incredibly, how can I say, mild manner. Anybody who has had malaria, and I had it a couple of times, and who had taken a treatment know that the side effects of these drugs can be horrendous. Artemisinin-based drugs have hardly any side effects. So it's a very efficient drug, highly efficient, and very little side effects. And Tu Youyou, for very good reasons, in 2015 got the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine for this discovery. Tremendously important. Now, what else? I said there were two elements that are key for these recent successes in malaria control. And the second one is vector control, closer to my heart. Because the pathogen itself is completely irrelevant to us if there is no means of transmission. And the transmission happens through mosquitoes. So if you take out the mosquito, there's no malaria. If you take out the mosquito, there is no dengue. If you take out the mosquito, there's no chikungunya. So if you target on the vector in an efficient manner, you eliminate the disease. And what you see here is a mother with her baby under an insecticide-treated bed net. Why? Because Anopheles gambiae, you remember, the #1 vector of malaria in Africa, is a night-active organism. So these mosquitoes tend to fly from 11 p.m. onwards until 4 a.m. in the morning. So if you are under a net that is treated with an insecticide, you're perfectly safe. And the chances that you get bitten and that you'll get bitten by a mosquito and that this mosquito transmits malaria are greatly reduced. The second, I said these mosquitoes are night active. Where are they during the day? Anopheles gambiae is what we refer to an anthropophilic mosquito, loves humans, loves human environment. The ladies, the men are completely irrelevant, they don't bite. But the ladies, the females, they bite. And these females spend a good part of their life indoors, and during the day they rest. And they rest primarily by sitting on the wall, especially on dark surfaces, because you don't spot a mosquito when it's sitting on a dark surface. So these mosquitoes spend the day indoors resting on these walls. Now, if you spray these walls with a very persistent, meaning long-lasting insecticide, you hit them two ways. You hit them during the night when they land on these mosquito nets and pick up the poison, if you want, and you hit them during the day when they try to rest and they're sitting on the walls, and they also pick up the poison, if you want, the insecticide. So these two components of vector control, insecticide-treated nets and what we refer to as indoor residual spraying, so spraying of insecticides indoors, have been key. But last but not least, how do you say, la plata, money played an enormously important role. And a shout out to the very often vilified Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, because they, if you want, discovered the problem of malaria in the early 2000s and mobilized a lot of their quasi-indefinite resources of their foundation to the fight against malaria. And they motivated then others to follow suit. So nowadays we have these giant rollback malaria initiative. We still have President Bush's anti-malaria project in Africa, often referred to as PEPFAR. We have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we have a lot of investment from national governments across sub-Saharan Africa that has been pouring resources into provision of drugs and distribution of nets, bed nets, and indoor residual spray. So mobilizing financial resources for administering effective curative drugs and administering effective vector control. These are the three, if you want, pillars for the successes that we've seen over the last 20 years. So you might think, all good. Unfortunately not. Because despite what I told you about these artemisinin co-therapy combining two active ingredients, we are starting to see resistance development in Plasmodium falciparum, which is the pathogen for the lethal tropical malaria. This usually starts in Southeast Asia. Resistance development against drugs, historically, anti-malaria drugs, historically starts in the so-called golden triangle of Southeast Asia, and from there it migrates into Africa. So we see a surge in resistance against the drugs, and we also see a surge in insecticide resistance in malaria-transmitting mosquito populations. Why is that so? Because the insecticide, the class of insecticides that are used in public health, that are used for treating the nets and that are used for indoor residual spraying, is a class that are called synthetic pyrethroids. They are very, if you want, good insecticides in the sense that they have very low mammalian toxicity, so they are not very toxic to us, and they are very persistent. So they are very long-lasting, which is exactly what you want for a public health insecticide. Unfortunately, they are also highly popular in agriculture. In reality, they are the workhorses of agricultural insecticides. They're used everywhere. They're used in cotton, they're used in sugarcane, they're used in ornamental crops, they're used in vegetable crops, meaning we have a lot of pyrethroids that are used in the environment, outside public health, outside mosquito control. And this broad use of this class of insecticides obviously enhances the chances that insects will develop resistance against it. And this is exactly what is happening in Anopheles gambia. And not only in Anopheles gambia, it is probably very difficult to see, but you have here in Anopheles species in Colombia, you have malaria-transmitting, disease-transmitting mosquito species in Colombia. You have an increasing problem with pyrethroid resistance. Now, the gloomy part of this is there are presently no alternatives in the pipeline. So there is no kind of new artemisinin-like pharmaceutical compound that is just prior to being released and is going to replace artemisinin. And the same is true for insecticides. There is no magical insecticide compound that is in the labs of some chemical companies waiting to be released and waiting to replace synthetic pyrethroids. So we are facing a situation where we are about to lose these two key columns of malaria control. And the last point is, as I showed you, the main focus of current malaria control strategies focuses on human settlements. So it's focusing on the indoor the indoor environment where traditionally most of the infections take place. Now imagine you're a mosquito and you're experiencing a dreadful situation in your normal habitat. You're constantly exposed to toxins when you go inside human dwellings. So what do? Do you die out or do you change your behavior? Obviously, evolution would predict that you would change your behavior. And this is exactly what is happening. You see a behavioral change of mosquitoes that traditionally tend to bite indoors to mosquitoes that start to bite outdoors. And you see a change in the diurnal pattern. Mosquito species that tended to bite late at night start to bite earlier. So you have more and more so-called outdoor biting behavior and early biting behavior. So these two behavioral changes kind of undermine what I've presented to you earlier as the great success story, nets and indoor residual spraying. Moreover, if you imagine you are Anopheles gambiae, the #1 vector, and you are hit hard with concerted control effort, how do your competitor, you're not alone, you're not the only one that can transmit malaria. There are other mosquito species that are also capable, other Anopheles species that are also capable of transmitting malaria. What happens to them? So we were looking, while I was working in Kenya, we were looking at what happens to the species composition, to this ratio of gambiae versus kind of secondary and tertiary mosquito species that can transmit malaria, that have different behavior, but that used to be completely irrelevant because the transmission was so much dominated by gambia. And we were looking at this phenomenon in the coastal area of Kenya, as you can see here. And this is an area, there are two areas in Kenya where you have great malaria problems. One is around the Lake Victoria Basin, and one is around the coastal region or across the coastal region in Kenya. And in these parts of Kenya, both around the Lake Victoria as well as the coast, malaria cases had been dropping dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. And exactly for the reasons that I explained to you before. So malaria control was very, very successful in these parts of Africa through nets, through indoor residual spraying, through the drugs. However, we also saw in these parts of Kenya increasing drug resistance, increasing insecticide resistance. And so we wanted to see how this kind of phenomenon over a period of 10, 15 years had shaped the mosquito communities in these areas. And as you can see here, over a period from 1990 to 2008, the proportion of Anopheles gambiae dramatically reduced. Basically, during this period of 2007, 2008, Anopheles gambiae became kind of an IUCN red-listed species that had more or less vanished. Whereas two other malaria-transmitting Anopheles species called Anopheles arabiensis and Anopheles merus picked up. And this is, again, evolution 101. If one competitor of yours is taken out, you start to benefit. You utilize the space that is suddenly becoming available for you. So we've seen in particular Arabiensis share and Arabiensis numbers going up dramatically. And two things that are very crucial here. Both these other Anopheles species are outdoor biting. So these are species that are not so anthropophilic, that are traditionally not so closely evolved with humans, but are more geared towards animals, so-called zoophilic species, but that are capable of transmitting malaria. So these two species are the ones that we have to keep an eye on because they're becoming more and more important. But the way we are doing control of malaria presently with these columns that I mentioned before, they are not adequate to address these species that are outside and that are targeting humans outside their dwellings. And there's, of course, climate change as another great threat of infectious diseases in general, having an impact on infectious diseases in general, and on malaria. Now, if you talk with malaria scientists, this is a very controversial area. There is not a kind of consensual attitude whether climate change is affecting malaria or not. Many scientists from the field attribute the changes that we are seeing more to drug failures. Classical case was the collapse of chloroquine, which used to be the drug choice in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, and which more or less vanished because of widespread resistance. Moreover, if you are in a situation where you are experiencing tremendous successes in malaria control, it's very difficult to pinpoint then factors like climate change that might be responsible for an uptick. Plus, most of the research on climate change and malaria has focused on the pathogen, so the Plasmodium falciparum, and not so much on Anopheles gambiae. However, I came across a 2023, very recent paper of a group from Georgetown University who did the Herculean task of looking at a data set that kind of expands from, or starts in 1898 to 2016, looking at the range shifts of 20 Anopheles species in Africa. And they were looking at both the effect over time on latitude as well as on altitude. Because we know that climate change can have an effect on a spatial expansion across latitudes, but more so on an altitudinal exchange. So what they found is they saw a range extension of about 4.7 kilometers per year over this period. And this is illustrated by these red arrows. So these red arrows stand for specific Anopheles species that have expanded their range over this nearly 100 years that they were observing. And this kind of range extension was significant in the vast majority of these species, but not for Gambier. In terms of altitudinal range extension, they could demonstrate an increase in altitude of the presence of these species of 6.5 meters per year, which is massive. And in this case, it was significant for 18 of these species, including Anopheles gambiae. So we have a significant effect. If we just look at Gambia as the #1 vector, we have a significant climate change effect on the altitudinal expansion. And this, Juliana and I, we can testify from our experience in Kenya. Even over a period of 10 years, grosso modo, that we lived there, we could see that mosquito problems became more severe in areas which were at, say, altitudes of 1,500, 1,600 meters, which had never which had never experienced malaria before, because simply of a warming effect. Now, one thing I found very particular, if you look at the latitudinal expansion, it's all southwards. So you see a species extension from the equator southwards into cooler parts of southern Africa. You don't see a similar move northwards. Why is that so? It seems that the northern part of the equator, so the part north of the equator, this is West and Central Africa, is becoming so incredibly hot. The effect of climate change in these areas are so dramatic. It's simply becoming too hot for these mosquitoes. So we are supposed to believe, or it's forecasted, that malaria is going to become, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, as West and Central Africa heats up tremendously, malaria is going to be a quote unquote a victim of this form of climate change. So there's predicted to be less malaria in West and Central Africa because of climate change, but the other way around. It's going to be simply too hot. Lastly, in terms of looming threats, we're back to global environmental change, and in particularly land use change. And here it's deforestation that is a very, very big driver. And this is particularly true for this part of the world. And you will see in a second. Despite these success stories that I reported to you earlier, we've been witnessing, and there has been documentation of an uptick of malaria in regions where deforestation happened. And this is particularly true for Latin America. Yet the drivers for this were a long time not really clear. And very often people believe that so-called domestication approaches are universally utilized and universally efficient to tame diseases. So by domesticating wild habitats, we're supposed to suppress the upsurge in infectious diseases, drain the swamps. Now, Vitor et al. In the Peruvian Amazon was studying Anopheles darlingi, which is the Gambia equivalent in tropical South America in terms of being the #1 vector. And they were looking at the effect of various degrees of deforestation in the Peruvian Amazon on the occurrence of Anopheles darlingi. And they could clearly show that with increasing deforestation, habitats are created by us that are incredibly conducive for mosquitoes. Just a quick reminder, the juvenile stages of mosquitoes are aquatic. So the females lay eggs into shallow water pools, and the larvae develop in the water. Now, these so-called man-made habitats, these little pools that are created when you start to log, when you start to clear forests, are incredibly potent sources for mosquito development. And the more you have these man-made habitats, the greater the population of mosquitoes. The same was observed by another American group in the Brazilian part of the Amazon, where they could clearly demonstrate, following road development and a penetration of roads and economic activity in pristine forest areas through deforestation, led to an upsurge in malaria. So how can you explain this? Roads and economic activity transport malaria into regions where people are immunonaive, communities are immunonaive, meaning they haven't experienced malaria before. They don't have this kind of acquired resistance that you only get if you grow up with malaria. And these immunonaive communities are incredibly susceptible to malaria, even as adults. So these kind of incidences of malaria lead to very, very high death tolls. Forestry, as I said, can create habitats, man-made habitats, that are very conducive for mosquitoes to thrive. And human activities like agriculture, especially if it's irrigated agriculture, and aquaculture contribute to this abundance of breeding grounds for mosquitoes. So what can we do about it? Now, there is some glimmer of hope. There's quite some strong evidence that, frankly, the richer a country gets, the more it plants forests, the more it plants trees. Good example, Vietnam. Good example, South Korea. Countries that have increased significantly the forest cover in their countries, especially in Vietnam, after a period of long deforestation tendencies, they're picking up. Sustainable forestry, or more sustainable approaches to forestry, especially through selective logging, not broad-scale logging, but selective logging, are apparently a much more intelligent way and also a much more sustainable way in terms of containing infectious diseases. And biodiversity, very important. You remember these little pools, photos of pools, these man-made pools that I tended to show you. These pools, these man-made pools, are very poor in terms of biodiversity. So there are very few organisms living in these pools, and they, because of this, because of lack of competition, because of lack of natural enemies, these pools are very conducive for Anopheles gambiae. So in reality, these studies are kind of myth busters in the sense that this domestication approach, drain the swamps, in reality has just the opposite effect. Biodiversity is a much stronger factor in containing the diseases. Eliminating biodiversity, reducing biodiversity, leads to an upsurge in diseases. So far, malaria. Let me wrap this up a little bit with some words on so-called emerging infectious diseases or arboviral diseases. What you see here is a satellite shot of the Horn of Africa, if you can spot it. Why is that so? Because the Horn of Africa is considered to be one of the hotbeds of these emerging infectious diseases, and you will see this in a second. Emerging infectious diseases are a tremendous threat to global health, and 70% of these emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, meaning they are vector-borne, transmitted by vectors. And in addition to climate change, very strong drivers for these emerging infectious diseases are demography, so population growth, land use changes, as we've seen before, and globalization. And among the most important and dangerous arboviral diseases are, you all know them, there's dengue, there's Rift Valley fever, there's Zika, and these are usually referred to as arboviral diseases, so arthropod-borne viral diseases. So they are transmitted by arthropods, many of them by mosquitoes, some of them also by sandflies, by ticks, and so on. I hope I can show you in the following couple of slides that understanding the socio-ecology of these emerging infectious diseases using this holistic One Health approach is more or less a a prerequisite for prediction as well as for management of these diseases. Yeah. The sad thing is that at present we know very, very little about many of these emerging infectious diseases, and I always love to use this example of West Nile virus, which, especially when you go to North America, it's a household name nowadays. It's a very, very important disease that is viral disease transmitted by mosquitoes. West Nile, Nomen est Omen, comes from the western part of Nile in northern Uganda. Was a completely unheard of disease, was described originally in 1938, but hardly anybody had worked about this until the disease showed up 1991 in New York. Serendipitously introduced into New York in 1991, actually on Long Island was the first record. Within 1 year, the disease reached Alaska. Now, no mosquito can fly in 1 year from Long Island to Alaska. Mosquitoes, in reality, are very poor flyers. How did they manage? Birds are secondary hosts of West Nile, which was unknown. So mosquitoes were biting birds. Birds were carrying the virus and flying across North America and spreading this disease like a wildfire. This was not known before. Why? Because nobody put a cent or $1 into research of West Nile in Uganda because it was irrelevant. Since now probably $1 billion has been spent, probably $5 billion have been spent on West Nile. So understanding basic parts of the ecology of these diseases can help us predict. Now, give you an example of spread is chikungunya. Probably have heard about it. Chikungunya in the Makonde language means that which bends. The Makondes is a small tribe, ethnic group that lives in southern Tanzania and in northern Mozambique. And chikungunya was described in this part of the world, again in the 1930s or 40s. Nobody paid attention to this. I believe in 2005 or 2006, there was the first outbreak. It's not even on the map here, on the Comore Islands, north of Madagascar. About 2 weeks or 2 months later, there was an outbreak on Réunion. Réunion is an island in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, which is a bit special because it's in French they call this département outre-mer. This is part of France, is an overseas territory of France. Being part of France is being part of the European Union, meaning it gets a lot of media attention. The outbreak of chikungunya on Réunion infected 80% of the population. 80% of the population of Réunion was sick. The economic fallout was in the tune of 2.5 billion euros. 5 months later, chikungunya was recorded. We're still talking about 2006, 2007. Was recorded in Kerala state in southern India. This is a CDC map from 2023. You see, basically, chikungunya is everywhere. Is everywhere. So we are talking about a disease that in a period of maybe a disease that nobody had on its radar. Nobody knew anything about it. Nobody knew the vectors, the ecology, the symptoms, nothing. A complete black box. Within a period of 10, 12 years, this disease spread globally. Zika is the same story. I mean, I could overlay this with Zika. It's exactly the same picture. So global trade and globalization can catapult these diseases within a very short period of time across our globe. Now, the symptoms of chikungunya, you probably know, is a dengue-like, is not as dangerous as dengue because it has a considerably lower incidence of hemorrhagic fever. But as I said, we have been witnessing within a period of 10 years a global spread of something that before the scientific community and especially the political community deemed irrelevant. and paid no attention to. Let me switch to another arboviral disease. This is Rift Valley fever. Rift Valley fever presently is restricted to Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. If you look at the CIA list of most threatening bioterrorism targets, Rift Valley fever is number 2 on their list. So they consider Rift Valley fever, if introduced to the United States, as the number 2 bioterrorism threat. It's transmitted by floodwater mosquitoes, a flabovirus, transmitted by floodwater mosquitoes. And interestingly, it affects both livestock and humans. More livestock than humans. It's lethal to livestock. It can be lethal to humans. And ironically, there is a vaccine available for livestock, but not for humans. The vaccine is deemed not safe for humans. So theoretically, and not only theoretically, we've seen instances where the herdsmen die of Rift Valley fever next to his vaccinated herd that are immunized against the disease. Now, Rift Valley fever is a very complicated disease because it comes in waves, very difficult to predict waves. And these waves are kind of interceded with sometimes year-long so-called inter-epidemic periods where nothing happens. So the last big wave in Eastern Africa was in 1997, 1998. And these Rift Valley fever outbreaks, they have a very high death toll among unvaccinated livestock and have a tremendously important impact on the economy of these affected countries. Some of the countries, especially again in this Horn of Africa, export of livestock towards the Arabian Peninsula, especially towards Saudi Arabia, is a very important component for their GDP. The moment there are reports of Rift Valley fever occurrence in these countries, Saudi Arabian meat market shuts down. So the impact, the economic impact of Rift Valley fever for these economies is tremendous. Early symptoms of Rift Valley fever in livestock are abortions. That's very often how vets spot it. Abortions in livestock, and humans that are affected by Rift Valley fever are usually falling in the category of people that work with the animals, so herdsmen, people that work with meat, especially bloody meat. So you have traditionally quite a high death toll in abattoirs, in slaughterhouses, as well as in butchers. So you have a group of people that is vulnerable because of the proximity with meat. We did a study a couple of years ago in Kenya where we were looking at this inter-epidemic period. We wanted to know what happens to the disease in these periods when there is no outbreak. Where is the disease? Where does the disease persist? And we were establishing herds of animals that were proven to be Rift Valley fever free in 3 hotspot areas, traditional hotspot areas of Kenya, where previously outbreaks of Rift Valley fever had occurred, around Lake Baringo, around Lake Naivasha, and at the Kenyan coast next to the border to Somalia. We studied the occurrence of the Rift Valley fever over a period of 3 years. Don't want to go very much into the details here. We found in 2 of these 3 studied areas, around Lake Baringo and at the coast, we found medium level of asymptomatic Rift Valley fever incidences in animals. Interestingly, we did not find it in the third area, which was around Lake Nawasha. And the difference between the herds in Nawasha compared to the herds in the two other regions was they were not driven into forests during the dry season. During the dry season, fodder becomes very short, and herdsmen tend to drive their animals, their herds, we're talking about sheep, goat, and particularly cattle, they drive them into forests because forests still provide some level of fodder. But forests are also areas where you find a lot of mosquitoes. So herds that were exposed to forest environments tended to test positive. Now, we were following this up with another study where we were looking at how climate and land use changes affects the movement of these herds. And we were looking at livestock in northeastern Kenya, and we used two different sets of tools. One set of tools was, as you can see here, a participatory one. So we were discussing with the herdsmen about the movement pattern of their herds. And these herdsmen were drawing maps. They were explaining us how they are traditionally driving their herds along a climate gradient, especially when the climate starts to become drier. And at the same time, we were geotagging some animals in these herds. We were putting GPS collars on certain animals, and we were observing them. So we had approximately 6 herds that we were monitoring, and in each of these herds, we had individuals that were geotagged. Now, prior to the study, we sampled blood and tested for the baseline, for the occurrence of Rift Valley fever, and then subsequently at different intervals, we are looking at disease incidence. And again, to cut a story short, 2 of these herds, 1178 and 1179, tend to be very mobile, and during the dry season spend extended periods of time in this Dondori forest in the coastal part of Kenya. And they were then, with the onset of the rains, these herds left the forest. And as you might expect, the herds that spent considerable time in the forest then tested positive for Rift Valley fever. So what we could show is that most likely because of the proximity to wildlife in the forest and wildlife as a potential reservoir for the virus, and the higher mosquito densities in these more moist forest environment enhances the risk of Rift Valley fever infections during these interepidemic periods. So what we could show is the disease doesn't vanish when it's not breaking out. It's there, it's at low level. What we still don't know is what triggers then these massive explosion in occurrence during these outbreak periods. So low level, okay, basically I've told you this. Let me come to the very last point, and this is studies that we are currently conducting on arboviral diseases in Namibia and in Kenya, particularly looking at this impact of human-wildlife interactions or human-wildlife conflicts. And the kind of increasing encroachment of humans into wild habitats like forest fuel this kind of conflicts, as you can see by this poor elephant here that was kind of munching away maize. But this maize field was a relatively recent one after forests were logged. Now, this kind of encroachment can lead to a spillover of pathogens from forest habitats into agricultural habitats. And this so-called spillover effect, as you can see here on the right side of the diagram, is supposed to be at the origin of many of these emerging diseases, Ebola, for example, Marburg virus, but also supposed to be potentially the origin of COVID. And yeah, so they are believed to be. And very often with arboviral diseases, for instance, like dengue, we are looking at a sylvatic environment and a sylvatic life cycle and an anthropophilic life cycle, which is characterized by two different types of vectors. So you have mosquito species that are predominant in forests, that are kind of circulating a disease among wildlife, but then transmit it through encroachment by humans into these former forest areas to humans. And there they are picked up by anthropophilic vectors and then suddenly create a new circle of infections in humans. That's how it is believed that diseases that used to be confined to non-human mammals jump the species border into humans. Now, as I said, we are working in a project with colleagues in Kenya and Namibia. And one of the aspects that we are kind of focusing on is diversity of arboviral diseases and looking at a link between diversity and disease incidence and disease prevalence. And I didn't put the elephant there for no reason. One of the factors that we are looking in particularly, and this is especially true for this area in Namibia where we are working, is we're looking at the effects of large mammals, large herbivores, in terms of their biodiversity and their effect on disease transmission and disease incidence in livestock as well as in humans. Now, in our work in Namibia was, if you want, like a clean slate in terms of arboviral diseases. This is about 30 to 40 years ago that the last time people looked into arboviral diseases in Namibia. So within the first 2 years of this project, we detected for the first time West Nile virus in Namibia. And as I said, West Nile, one of the most dangerous arboviral diseases worldwide. And we also could find Bagaza virus, which is an arboviral disease of poultry and a huge threat to the poultry industry worldwide. Likewise, in a similar study, we were looking more, not so much at mosquitoes, but also at biting midges as vectors of arboviral diseases. And these orbiviruses that we were spotting include hugely important diseases like blue tongue. Blue tongue is one of the #1 livestock diseases in the world, and especially for us in Europe, plus also the Pallium virus. And as I said, our research there was the first, and this was the first time in 35, 40 years that people were looking at arboviral diseases in Namibia. And not only could we detect this Pallium virus, but we found 5 novel orbiviruses in Namibia, which are potentially a threat to livestock as well as to humans. In addition, we found, or we could observe, a very, very high genetic diversity of these arboviruses in the region, in this northern part of Namibia where we have been working. And we think that this high degree of diversity, the high incidence of arboviral diseases that we were able to detect there, we spotted there, are due to land use changes. So I'm coming back to the spillover effect, encroachment of humans through activities like agriculture into pristine forest habitats are causing this kind of spread of arboviral diseases. Let me wrap this up. What I hope you take home from this is that climate change and land use change in certain cases can have a tremendous effect on infectious diseases in general, and I believe particularly for vector-borne diseases. It's pretty clear that the tropics will be much harder hit by these effects of climate change than the more temperate zones. I hope it comes across that a key requisite to deal with these problems is a deep understanding of the socio-ecology of the diseases and particularly of the vectors of these diseases. And this One Health approach, this One Health paradigm, the way to look at such a problem in a more holistic fashion is, according to me, the right approach. I don't think that there are any kind of silver bullets to address this problem. And anybody who has studied a little bit the history of malaria, especially the history of malaria control, will know that all our previous attempts in finding such a silver bullet failed. So complex problems require complex answers. And that's why a more encompassing approach like One Health is much more suited for tackling such complex problems. Money is absolutely crucial. Sustained funding for such research is absolutely pivotal. Now, we've heard during COVID all kinds of pledges from politicians. Now we're going to take this serious. Now we are really going to invest into prevention. We've lost so much during the epidemic. This was such a toll on our societies. This was such a toll on our economies. This is not going to happen again. Now we're going to safeguard. Now we're going to invest into science. How long is the epidemic gone? Like a year and a half. And kind of these promises fizzle out. I think robust public health systems are the best safeguard against these diseases. Why is malaria such a small problem here compared to sub-Saharan Africa? You have a much better, robust, efficient public health system than in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So investing into efficient public health, an efficient public health system, addressing these problems is, if you want, that's the silver bullet. So having a robust public health system, according to me, is really tackling the root problem of many of these disease problems. With this, I would like to thank you, and I'm happy to entertain questions. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a todos los asistentes. Ahora la doctora Juliana nos va a hacer algunos comentarios, una sinopsis sobre la presentación del profesor Burgemeister, importantísima para la sede y para el país. Creo que para nosotros acá en la institución, y no me equivoco al decirlo, es un abrir de ojos, es un tomar conciencia de una problemática que existe y que no estamos incluyendo en nuestra agenda. Porque si bien nosotros, profesor Burgemeister y Juliana, doctora Juliana, acá no tenemos medicina en la sede, creo que sí tenemos el conocimiento, la técnica, la tecnología para poder de manera conjunta con el gobierno, con el Estado, con los sistemas de salud, con las facultades de medicina, trabajar de la mano y contribuir en la solución a estos problemas. Y una solución que todavía puede ser anticipada al gran problema. Esto es un despertar para toda la institución. Doctora Juliana, el auditorio es suyo.
Muchas gracias. ¿Está bien el sonido? ¿Sí? Ok. Bueno, para aquellos que llegaron un poco tarde, mi nombre es Juliana Jaramillo. Yo soy manizaleña, pero he estado mucho tiempo trabajando. Yo soy esposa y colega de Cristian y trabajo en la parte de One Health, pero en la parte agrícola, y soy entomóloga agrícola. Entonces voy a tratar de hacer una sinopsis y sin masacrar mucho la parte de entomología médica de Cristian. Bueno, él empieza su charla hablando sobre las crisis planetarias, sobre el cambio climático, sobre el cambio del uso de la tierra y la necesidad de pasar de un sistema de pensamiento reduccionista a uno holístico, donde tengamos en cuenta muchos más factores y dejemos de estar mirando los problemas en pequeñas partes. Presenta el paradigma de One Health o de una salud como una salud que es animal, medioambiental, humana, y estas saludes están interconectadas. Lo que hemos visto con COVID, por ejemplo, es que si se afecta la salud medioambiental, se afectan los otros, digamos que pilares. Entonces tenemos que tener mucho cuidado en mantener como un balance en estas saludes. Presenta este paradigma a través de 2 casos de estudio que son enfermedades transmitidas por vectores. La primera, malaria, con un foco en la África subsahariana, y las enfermedades infecciosas emergentes transmitidas por arboviruses. Estas son como dengue, chikungunya, fiebre del Rift Valley y otras. En cuanto a malaria, explica que es probablemente el mayor factor de mortalidad en el África subsahariana. Cuenta sobre los casos de éxito de malaria al principio a través de medicinas, como son combinaciones de artemisina y otros medicamentos convencionales. La artemisina, un medicamento natural derivado de una planta en China, y también el control de los vectores, porque si se controlan los vectores, obviamente se controla la enfermedad, y este control se ha hecho a través de campañas de financiación muy grande, particularmente de la fundación de Bill and Melinda Gates, con 2 estrategias, con mosquiteros que son tratados con piretroides y con aplicaciones de insecticidas dentro de las casas. Se logró una reducción de los casos de malaria entre el 45 y el 49% y una reducción de muertes desde el 2000 de alrededor de 3.3 millones, pero se han estado observando cambios tanto en el Plasmodium como en los vectores, en los mosquitos. Entonces, resistencia a enfermedades, a las medicinas, a artemisina, que es la única medicina básicamente que queda contra malaria, y selección de mosquitos. Los Anopheles gambiae pican de noche, pican a determinadas horas de la noche y siempre están descansando durante el día en las casas, y lo que ha pasado con los mosquiteros impregnados en insecticida es que se han seleccionado poblaciones de mosquitos que pican fuera de las casas y durante el día o mucho más temprano. O sea, no hay medidas de control de estos insectos, y no se hace mucha investigación o no se destinan muchos fondos a este tipo de investigación, y él hace al final un llamado a que la resolución de este tipo de problemas es muy importante tener apoyo financiero y tener un apoyo del sector público. Bueno, habla mucho sobre el cambio del uso de la tierra y el incremento en el problema de malaria, sobre todo en Latinoamérica, particularmente la deforestación y la creación de charcos muy grandes y la disminución de la biodiversidad. porque los charcos solamente no son los culpables, digamos, pero charcos menos diversidad. Digamos que los mosquitos, como los estados larvales de los mosquitos son acuáticos, si no hay otros organismos que estén ahí comiendo, no sé, libélulas, sapos, otros organismos, pues las poblaciones van a ser muy altas. Y luego pasa a hablar de las enfermedades infecciosas emergentes y presenta, dice que son 70% de ellas son zoonóticas o transmitidas por vectores. Las más importantes, dengue, zika, fiebre del Valle del Rift, y dice que el entendimiento holístico de estas enfermedades, de su ecología, es lo que va a hacer posible en el futuro. Hacer más fácil el pronóstico de la emergencia de estas enfermedades y de su manejo. Y presenta 3 ejemplos. El primero es el virus del oeste del Nilo, el West Nile virus, que se introdujo en Estados Unidos como en el 91, ¿dice? En el 91, y de ahí se expandió en un año desde Nueva York hasta Alaska, y no entendían por qué, y era por las aves migratorias. Entonces ahí vemos una vez más que si no hay un entendimiento de toda la ecología, de cuáles son los organismos que están relacionados con los mosquitos, pues va a ser más difícil controlarlo. El segundo fue el caso de presenta chikungunya, y muestra la globalización y la expansión de la enfermedad por los viajes, por la globalización en general. Y el tercer caso es la fiebre del Rift Valley en el este de África, y básicamente muestra a través de muchos ejemplos y datos aquí cómo en unos estudios no entendían por qué algunos rebaños de ganado en unas partes de Kenia durante la época donde no había brotes de la enfermedad estaban infectados y otros no, hasta que se dieron cuenta que en las áreas donde los pastoralistas llevaban los rebaños al bosque, alimentarse durante la época seca, allá era como el reservorio del virus, y entonces volvían cuando es la época húmeda, y ahí era donde se causaba pues el brote. Para esta fiebre del Rift Valley hay vacunas para el ganado, para los animales, pero no para los humanos, que es otro problema. Y da unos mensajes finales que son básicamente entre más cambiemos el uso de la tierra, entre más deforestemos, entre más tengamos pues un efecto negativo en la biodiversidad, más posibilidades habrá que cada día vaya a haber más y más enfermedades infecciosas. Ya lo vimos con COVID, se ha visto con ébola en el pasado y con muchas otras enfermedades. Entonces es como decía el doctor, es un llamado a proteger el medio ambiente, a cuidar la biodiversidad y a no invadir esas zonas de alta biodiversidad, porque cuando se hace el cruce como entre la agricultura y sobre todo irrigada, el conflicto humano con las, ¿cómo se dice? Como los animales o la fauna silvestre, ahí es donde se presenta el problema. Dice que los trópicos están especialmente vulnerables a la emergencia de nuevos virus, de nuevas enfermedades infecciosas, y dice que pues como que una salud o One Health es el camino para tratar de mantener un balance en todo esto, teniendo en cuenta todos los parámetros y como en armonía con la naturaleza. Con esto pues muchas gracias y abrimos la sección de preguntas.
Muchas gracias, doctora Juliana, por la sinopsis. Tenemos unos minutos para tomar tal vez 3 preguntas del auditorio. Las preguntas las vamos a hacer en español. Les presento aquí a la profesora Natalia Rondón. Natalia va a hacer la traducción para que podamos tener la respuesta del profesor Borgemeister. Entonces, no sé si alguien del auditorio quisiera hacer alguna pregunta en estos momentos. Profesora Elizabeth.
Okay, I will try to make the question in English. It's not all good, but I will try. Thank you very much for coming here. You're welcome to Manizales and to our campus. This is your house, also your home. My question, perhaps there is some controversy about some investigation that was developed later years by a scientific professor that is from Universidad Nacional, Patarroyo. I believe perhaps you have listened about him. I don't know. He developed, or they say, or people say that he developed a vaccine for malaria. And it seems like this vaccine was not so good or so efficient for preventing the malaria. I believe, of course, that develop vaccine is difficult. Almost all your presentation and was about treatments, not about preventing. Preventing is difficult. I don't know if you have listened about this vaccine, but if you listen about that, what do you think about that? If not, what is the special difficulty in developing vaccines?
Okay, I've heard about this particular vaccine that was developed. If you would have asked me this 3-4 years ago, I would have brushed it off. I would have said, these people, they have been working on malaria vaccines for 30-40 years, and they have made, in reality, no real progress. And there are more fruitful avenues than vaccine development. Why? Because Plasmodium falciparum, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, is a very highly developed pathogen. And if you compare this with a bacteria or with the virus, evolutionary speaking, we're looking at much more simple organisms. And as far as I know, in the history of vaccine development, there has never been a success against such a highly evolved pathogenic organism. This would have been my answer 3-4 years ago. Now I stand to be corrected. You know that there are 2 vaccines, apart from the one here from Manizales, there are 2 vaccines that are currently in large-scale field testing in Burkina Faso, one, and in Kenya, the other. And these have been vaccines where people have been working for like 20 years on. And the first results look relatively promising. What I heard about the vaccine that is currently tested in Burkina Faso, they reckon that you get a protection level of between 30 to 40% in children under 5, which is something, but which is also not everything. So my take is, I come back to One Health. Everything that can contribute is good. I don't think that a malaria vaccine is going to be a silver bullet. But if you have a vaccine that can prevent disease outbreak in children to an extent of 30 to 40%, this is better than nothing. This is better than nothing. So I would always advocate for it. However, vaccination campaigns are notoriously difficult and expensive. Very very expensive and very difficult. And as far as I know, the immunization and protection level is for about 2 to 3 years. And then the kids need to be vaccinated again. So at the end of the day, it's the money that will kind of decide whether this is a successful strategy or not. I haven't talked about genetic approaches. There is a lot of discussion about using gene editing and novel molecular technologies to modify vectors. That's another area which is very modern, which is very promising, relatively expensive, and very controversial. My take would be anything that goes, anything that contributes is welcome, but you have to look at it also from a financial point of view. There is a certain budget for malaria control, and especially governments in sub-Saharan Africa, they will have to make a very hard decision. Where am I going to put my money on? Am I going to put my money on a vaccine? Am I going to put my money into new genetic control strategies? Am I going to put my money on drugs? So at the end of the day, it's also a financial decision, but vaccines can be terrifically, look at COVID. Yeah, look at COVID. This is a miracle. And the guys from BioNTech, Pfizer-BioNTech, they're working on an mRNA-based anti-malaria vaccine. Maybe this is going to be a success like the COVID vaccine. Who knows? So I would be open-minded, but I would be cautious.
Bueno, Gabo, ¿ahí me escuchan todos? Bueno, la pregunta de la profesora era sobre especialmente la vacuna. ¿Sí está bien? Claro que sí. ¿Acá? Bueno, permiso. La pregunta de la profesora fue sobre la vacuna pues, que el doctor Manuel Elkin Patarroyo desarrolló en Colombia y pues si las vacunas son una buena salida, ¿cierto?, para este tipo de problemas y de crisis planetarias que estamos enfrentando. El profesor nos responde pues que la vacuna, ¿cierto?, sí es una muy buena estrategia, pero finalmente él cree que el paradigma One Health, ¿cierto?, finalmente es la solución mayor a este tipo de problemas y que obviamente las vacunas sí son muy beneficiosas, pero que dependen de muchos factores económicos muchas veces y pues sociales que son muy difíciles de llevar a todo el territorio.
También mencionó el profesor que se están desarrollando otras estrategias basadas en genética, variaciones genéticas. ¿Alguien más tiene alguna pregunta en el auditorio? Muy bien. Entonces, si no es así, Professor Burgermeister, thank you very much on behalf of my community. We hope you have a safe trip back to Germany, and we will see each other again in the near future. We are going to continue with the agreement between our two universities. Doctora Juliana, esperamos tenerla aquí en la sede nuevamente en los próximos meses. Muchísimas gracias a todos los asistentes. No puedo dejar de aprovechar para darle un saludo muy especial a nuestro profesor Jorge Eduardo Salazar, el Mono Salazar, exdecano de la Facultad de Ingeniería. También se encuentra acá con nosotros Camila Castillo, la doctora Camila Castillo, primera gestora del departamento, y a todos los que asistieron, nuestro agradecimiento más especial. Les estaremos compartiendo el video de esta conferencia. Muchísimas gracias. Cerremos con un aplauso de alegría por haber logrado esto.